The alarm in the reading hall was not loud. It did not need to be. A single soft chime meant that someone had broken a rule that had stood for 11,000 cycles, and every curator in the building felt it in their chest before they heard it in their ears. I am Ves Cathal, third curator of the Pan-Human Continuity Archive. I was standing at the far end of the reading hall, checking the seals on a newly arrived case of files, when the chime sounded. I turned, and I saw her. Grace Whitfield sat at the reading table with her hands folded, completely still, while the projection above her glowed with the full timeline of Catastrophe file number 4,206. It was a plague record, 2 centuries of suffering, compressed into data. My predecessors had spent 11 full cycles annotating that single file, cross-referencing every decision, every delay, every death. Grace had opened it 40 minutes ago. The chime meant she had reached the final page. I crossed the hall quickly, my robes catching on the stone floor, and I did not bother to hide my alarm. No visiting scholar had ever finished a first-tier file in less than a full turning of the moon. We built the reading rooms for slowness. We built the lighting to be gentle, the chairs to be comfortable for long sittings, the silence to be complete, because grief cannot be rushed, and understanding cannot be forced. Grace looked up at me before I reached her. Her eyes were calm. Not cold, just calm, in a way that unsettled me more than anger would have. I asked her, as politely as my training allowed, whether she required assistance, whether the projection had malfunctioned, whether she had, perhaps, only skimmed the file rather than read it. She shook her head. I read it, she said. All of it. Every entry, every timestamp, every committee transcript. I did not believe her. I asked her to prove it, which was itself a violation of etiquette, but the chime had rattled something loose in me. She did not seem offended. She simply reached forward, tapped the projection, and pulled up a section from deep within the file, a set of internal communications between the Plague Ministry's senior scientists on day 190 of the outbreak. She read the exchange back to me, not word for word, because our archive law forbids direct reproduction even in casual conversation, but she described its content with total accuracy, the scientists arguing that the vaccine timeline needed to move faster, the administrators explaining that faster was not possible without violating procurement law, the quiet, terrible agreement to wait. I had read that same exchange myself, decades ago, during my own training. It had taken me 3 full days to process the weight of it. She had absorbed it in under a minute and could recount it perfectly. I sat down across from her, not because protocol demanded it, but because my legs suddenly felt unwilling to hold me while standing. 200 years, she said quietly, 200 years, and they never learned to move as fast as the danger did. I told her, with as much dignity as I could gather, that speed was not the point of the file. The file existed as a memorial, as a warning meant to be absorbed slowly, so that its lessons could settle into the bones of whoever studied it, rather than be consumed and forgotten in an instant. Grace tilted her head. Then why does the warning only exist after everyone in it is already gone? I had no answer prepared for that question, because no one had ever asked it inside these walls before. She looked back at the glowing timeline, at the neat, sorrowful graph showing the rise of infections against the painfully flat line of the ministry's response. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, the only sign of feeling I had seen from her since she arrived. Then she said the words that would follow me for the rest of my duties in this archive, words I would repeat to the assembly, words that would eventually be etched, whether the assembly liked it or not, into the very stone above the reading hall doors. Too slow, she said. I asked her to explain herself. I told her that our order did not use that phrase lightly, that speed without care had caused as many catastrophes as caution ever prevented, and that I had personally cataloged files where haste alone had doomed entire settlements. She did not argue with me. She simply nodded, accepting the point without conceding her own. I'm not saying move without thinking, she said. I'm saying they had the thinking done. Look here. She tapped the timeline again, highlighting a single point, 340 days before the first recorded death. Their own scientists identified the pathogen here. They knew what it was. They knew how it spread. Everything after this point is not thinking. It's waiting to be allowed to act on thinking they already finished. I looked at the mark she indicated. I had seen it 1,000 times in my studies. I had never once considered it the way she was suggesting, as a hinge point, a place where the story could have bent in another direction if only someone had moved when the knowledge was already complete. They needed confirmation, I said. Multiple confirmations. That is standard practice across nearly every civilization in this archive. Confirmation of what? She said. They confirmed it here. She tapped the same mark again. Everything after that is just people being afraid to be the one who says stop the world. We have a problem, right now, before it is polite to say so. The hall around us had gone very quiet. I realized, glancing sideways, that several other curators had gathered near the entrance, drawn by the chime, now listening without pretending not to listen. I asked Grace how she had managed to process such an enormous file in such an impossibly short span of time. I expected her to describe some hidden technology, some device smuggled past our inspection, some trick of her species that I could report and have confiscated before it damaged the sanctity of our collection. Instead, she simply shrugged. I read fast, she said, and I've read files like this before. Different planet, different century, same shape. You start to recognize the shape. The shape, I repeated. Warning, delay, consequence. She said it like a chant, like something she had said many times before, perhaps to herself, in the quiet hours when no one else was listening. It's the same shape almost every time, just the names change. I told her that this could not possibly be true across the full breadth of our collection. 10 million files, 10 million different species, different worlds, different catastrophes born from war, from disease, from failing stars, from broken machines that turned against their makers. Surely such variety could not share one single shape. She looked at me, and for the first time since she had entered the reading hall, something like sympathy crossed her expression, though I could not yet tell whether it was sympathy for the dead in the files, or sympathy for me, for not having noticed what she had noticed within her first hour inside these walls. Pull 10 more, she said. Any 10. I'll show you. It was an outrageous request. No visitor had ever been permitted to select files at random for personal review, let alone 10 in a single sitting, let alone with the clear intention of comparing them against each other in search of a pattern that our own scholars, across 11,000 cycles of devoted study, had never named. I should have refused. Every instinct trained into me by generations of curators told me to refuse, to escort her gently from the reading hall, to file a formal complaint with the coalition liaison regarding the unusual speed and manner of her engagement with sacred material. Instead, I found myself standing, walking to the retrieval terminal and selecting 10 files completely at random from 10 different corners of our collection, spanning worlds I had never visited and species long since gone from the stars. I told myself it was to prove her wrong. I told myself that once she failed to find her pattern across such a wide and deliberately scattered sample, she would understand the depth and complexity of what our archive actually held, and she would return to a proper, respectful pace of study. I brought the 10 files to her table myself, refusing to allow an assistant to carry them, because some part of me wanted to witness whatever happened next with my own eyes, unfiltered by anyone else's account. Grace thanked me, opened the first file, and began to read. I did not leave the table. I stood beside her, watching the projection shift and scroll at a speed that made my vision blur if I tried to follow every line, and I began, quietly, to count the minutes on the small chronometer built into my sleeve. The gathered curators near the entrance had not dispersed. If anything, more had joined them. Word of the chime and the strange human reading files at impossible speed had apparently traveled through the archive's upper halls faster than I would have believed possible for news that did not concern a genuine catastrophe. I did not know it yet, standing there watching her eyes move across the glowing text, but the true catastrophe of this particular cycle was not contained in any of the 10 million files stored beneath our floors. It was sitting in front of me, reading faster than any being I had ever encountered, quietly reshaping everything I believed about the purpose of our sacred and terrible collection. And somewhere, far beyond the walls of our archive, on a colony world none of us had yet heard the name of, a machine deep in the atmosphere was already beginning to fail in ways its own operators had not yet noticed. One of the senior curators, an elder named Oren Vask, approached the table and asked me in a low voice whether I intended to halt the reading session. He reminded me that our charter required a formal review before any visitor could access more than one file per cycle, and that Grace had now technically exceeded that limit 9 times over in less than 2 hours. I told him I would allow the session to continue. I do not fully know why I said it. Perhaps some part of me understood, even then, that stopping her would not stop whatever had already started the moment she read that first plague file and called it slow. Oren did not argue further. He simply folded his hands and stood beside the other curators, watching, the way the rest of us were watching, unable to look away from something none of us had a name for yet. Grace finished the second file in 26 minutes. The third took only 19. By the fifth file, she had stopped speaking entirely, her attention narrowed to a single point of total concentration, her fingers occasionally tapping the projection to mark something for later, though she never explained what those marks meant. Not yet. I watched her face during the seventh file, a record of a dying star system whose inhabitants had built an evacuation fleet only to argue for 6 years over which families would be granted the first departures. I watched her jaw tighten again, the same small motion from before, and I understood, without her saying a single word, that she had found her pattern once more. By the time she reached the 10th file, the reading hall had gone almost entirely silent, except for the soft hum of the projections and the quiet, steady breathing of every curator gathered near the entrance, none of us quite ready to admit what we were witnessing and none of us quite able to leave. The countdown, though none of us knew it that day, had already begun. By morning I had not slept. I do not think Grace had slept either, though when I found her again in the reading hall, she looked no different than she had the day before, calm, alert, already working. She had requested a private terminal of her own, separate from the standard reading table, and she had filled it with charts I did not recognize, lines crossing lines, colors marking things I could not yet interpret. I asked her what she was building. She told me it was called a latency map. When I asked her to explain the term in simpler words, she smiled slightly, the first real smile I had seen from her, and said it was a map of waiting, not waiting in the way a traveler waits for a transport, but waiting in the way a civilization waits between knowing a danger is real and finally deciding to act against it. She showed me the plague file from the day before, now reduced to a single glowing line on her display. The line stayed flat for a long stretch, then rose sharply, then flattened again near the top, where the dying had already outpaced any possible response. "This flat part," she said, pointing to the first stretch of the line, "that's the gap. That's the space between the scientists knowing and the leaders acting. 340 days of flat line, doing basically nothing while people were already being infected." I told her that caution during those days may have prevented a different disaster, an economic collapse, a panic, a breakdown of order that could have killed as many people as the plague itself. She nodded, without dismissing the concern the way I expected her to. "I know," she said. "I read the overreaction files too, last night, after you all thought I'd gone to rest. There are plenty of examples where moving too fast broke things just as badly as moving too slow." She turned her display toward me, showing another line, this one rising sharply at the very start, dropping into chaos, then climbing again into a second and worse catastrophe caused entirely by the panic of the first response. "So which is right?" I asked, honestly uncertain for the first time in longer than I could remember. "Slow or fast?" "Neither," she said. "Correct is right. Fast when the evidence says fast. Slow when the evidence says slow. The problem in almost every file I've read isn't the speed itself. It's that the speed of the decision has nothing to do with the speed of the danger. They move at the speed of their meetings, not the speed of their disaster. I sat with that thought for a long moment, watching the two lines glow side by side on her display. One dead slow into ruin, one dead fast into a different ruin, both failures born from the same root cause, dressed in opposite clothing. She began pulling more files that morning, not scattered at random this time, but chosen deliberately, cross-referenced against each other by category. Disease outbreaks, failing infrastructure, rogue constructs turning against their builders, first encounters between species that ended in bloodshed rather than understanding. Each time, she built the same kind of line, the same shape of waiting followed by consequence, and each time she marked the exact point where the knowing had finished and the waiting had begun. By midday, the pattern she had promised me on the first day had become impossible to deny. Across nearly every file in her growing collection, the shape repeated itself with an almost mechanical consistency. Someone inside the doomed civilization had known, not guessed, known, with data, with confidence, often years or months, or at minimum days before the worst of the harm began. And then, almost universally, that knowledge had sat inside a committee, a council, a ministry, a chain of approval, gathering dust while the danger it described continued to grow entirely unaffected by anyone's hesitation. I asked her, quietly, whether her own species suffered from the same weakness. I expected her to defend humanity, to claim some special exemption from the pattern she had spent the entire morning proving against every other civilization in our collection. Instead, she pulled up a file I did not recognize, one that had only recently been added to our archive under the new Coalition Data Sharing Agreement. A human file, a plague from her own species' history, centuries old by her account, though recent by the standard of our archive's oldest records. The line on this file followed the same terrible shape as all the others: knowledge early, response late, death in the gap between them. "We're not special," she said, and there was no defensiveness in her voice at all, only a kind of tired honesty that I found more convincing than any argument could have been. "We have the gap too. We've always had it. The difference is we started trying to close it on purpose, instead of just writing memorials about it afterward." I asked her what closing the gap actually meant, in practice, beyond simply wishing that people would decide things faster. She explained it to me the way a teacher explains something they have already thought through many times, patiently, without condescension. She told me about systems her people had built, imperfect but improving, meant to shorten the distance between someone noticing a danger and the wider group being allowed to respond to it. Alarms that did not require a vote before they were permitted to sound. Officials whose entire authority existed for exactly this purpose, to be believed instantly, without the delay of proving themselves first, because the proving had already been done in advance, before the danger ever arrived. "It's not perfect," she said. "We still get it wrong. People still die in the gap sometimes, even now, but the gap used to be measured in years, and now, for the things we've learned to take seriously, it's measured in minutes." I found myself, for the first time in my long service as a curator, questioning the very purpose of the institution I had devoted my life to. We had built the Pan-Human Continuity Archive to preserve memory, to honor the dead, to offer warning to the living. But warning, I was beginning to understand, was not the same as protection. A warning that arrives after the fact, however beautifully preserved, however carefully annotated, does nothing at all to close the gap that killed the people it describes. I asked her, almost afraid of the answer, what she intended to do with the pattern she had found. She looked at me directly, and for a moment, the calm in her expression sharpened into something closer to determination, something I would come to recognize over the following weeks as the truest part of her character. "I want to build something that watches for the gap while it's still open," she said. "Not after, while. I want an alarm that doesn't wait for a committee to agree it's allowed to ring." I told her that such a system would require access far beyond what any single visiting scholar had ever been granted within our archive, and that the Coalition Assembly would almost certainly refuse to authorize it, given how deeply it would challenge the authority of every civilization's own internal decision structures. "Then I'll show them the numbers first," she said, "and let the numbers do the arguing." She spent the rest of that day, and much of the following night, building exactly that. A single unified chart, drawn from over 100 files by the time she finished, plotting the average length of the gap across every catastrophe in our collection against the survival rate of the civilizations involved. The relationship was not subtle. It was not open to gentle interpretation. The longer the gap between knowing and acting, almost without exception, the higher the final cost in lives. When she finally showed the chart to me, late into the night, with the reading hall empty except for the two of us, and the quiet hum of failing candlelight fixtures that our order had never bothered to modernize, she did not look triumphant. She looked tired, and a little sad, the way I imagine anyone looks after spending an entire day proving, over and over, in 100 different ways, exactly how preventable so much suffering had always been. 10 million files, she said quietly, staring at the chart. 10 million warnings. Nobody was fast enough to use in time. I did not have a response prepared for her. I simply stood beside her, looking at the chart myself, and for the first time I understood, in a way that went beyond intellectual acceptance and settled instead into something closer to grief, exactly what she had meant on that very first day, with that very first file. Too slow. Not cruel, not foolish, simply, tragically, too slow, again and again, across every corner of the stars our archive had ever reached. News of her chart traveled faster than either of us expected. By the following morning, a formal request had arrived from the Coalition Liaison Office, asking why a visiting human scholar had spent an unauthorized night generating cross-species statistical analysis from restricted archive material. I was summoned to explain myself before the matter escalated further. I stood before 3 senior members of the liaison office, none of whom I had met in person before that day, and I did the only thing that felt honest. I showed them the chart myself, rather than allowing anyone else to describe it secondhand. The eldest of the 3, a stern official named Callum Drace, studied the chart for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up, his expression was not anger, as I had expected, but something closer to discomfort, the look of someone confronted with a truth they would have preferred to avoid a little longer. "This human built this from our own archive," he said, not quite a question. I confirmed that she had, and that I had permitted the access myself, taking full responsibility rather than allowing the blame to settle anywhere near Grace. Callum asked what she intended to do with such an analysis. I told him, honestly, that she wished to build a system capable of detecting the gap while it was still forming, rather than only recording it afterward for future study. The second official, a quieter woman named Priya Ashworth, spoke for the first time, asking whether such a system had ever been attempted before within any civilization represented in our collection. I admitted that, to my knowledge, it had not. Every file in our archive, without exception, recorded catastrophe after the fact. None recorded prevention in progress, because prevention in progress, by its very nature, rarely produced the kind of tragedy worth preserving for 11,000 cycles of careful study. Callum considered this for a long moment, then asked the question I had been dreading since the summons arrived. "And do you believe her theory is correct?" I thought of the plague file from the first day, of the 10 scattered files that followed, of the 100 files behind her final chart, each one telling some version of the same quiet, devastating story. I thought of the flat line stretching across 340 days, while a preventable disaster grew larger, with every hour that no one acted. "I believe," I said slowly, "that I have spent my entire career preserving evidence of a mistake that keeps repeating itself, without ever once asking why it repeats, or whether it could be stopped." The room was silent after that. Priya Ashworth exchanged a glance with Callum that I could not fully read, some mixture of concern and reluctant respect passing between them. In the end, they did not grant Grace the authority she wanted. Not yet. They told her, through me, that theoretical analysis of historical files was one matter, but active intervention in a living civilization's affairs was an entirely different and far more serious question, one that would require full assembly review before any such system could ever be authorized for use. Grace received this news calmly when I delivered it to her that evening. She did not argue, though I had expected her to. She simply nodded, closed her chart, and asked me a single question instead. How long does a full assembly review usually take? I told her the honest answer, the number every curator in our order knew by memory, an average of 180 days, from initial request to final decision, accounting for scheduling, deliberation, and the inevitable delays caused by competing priorities among assembly members. Grace looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something settle behind her eyes, some private calculation completing itself. 180 days, she repeated quietly. That's a gap too. I did not fully understand what she meant by that comment until much later, when the true test of her theory arrived far sooner than any of us expected, in a form none of us could have predicted, on a world whose name I had never once heard spoken before that particular week. The name of the world was Thren Vahal, and I first heard it spoken not by an official announcement, but by an assistant curator named Fenlo Brask, who burst into the private study room where Grace and I had been reviewing yet another batch of files, breathless in a way I had never seen him before. He told us that a routine sensor report had come through the Coalition data relay, flagged as low priority, buried among hundreds of other minor status updates from colony worlds across 3 systems. An atmospheric processor on Thren Vahal, the primary source of breathable air for a colony of nearly 200,000 people, was showing readings that did not match its expected operating pattern. Grace was on her feet before Fenlo finished the sentence. She asked him to pull the raw data immediately. Not the summary, not the official assessment, the raw sensor feed itself, exactly as it had been recorded. Fenlo hesitated, glancing at me for permission, since raw Coalition sensor feeds were not standard reading material for archive scholars, visiting or otherwise. I gave the permission before he could ask a second time. The feed appeared on the terminal a moment later, and Grace leaned forward immediately, scanning it with the same total concentration I had watched her bring to 100 Catastrophe files over the previous weeks. I stood beside her, trying to follow the numbers myself, though most of them meant little to me without her guidance. "This isn't low priority," she said after a long moment, her voice flat in a way that worried me more than if she had sounded alarmed. "This is early. This is exactly the point in every file I've shown you where someone knew and didn't act yet." She pulled up a comparison, laying the Thren Vahal readings directly beside the plague file from her very first day in the archive, the same file that had started all of this. The shapes of the 2 curves, though describing entirely different kinds of danger, were unmistakably similar. A slow drift away from normal, still small enough to explain away, still small enough for a committee to reasonably ask for more data before committing to any drastic response. I asked her what specifically the readings indicated. She explained, patiently, that the processor's core stabilization system appeared to be losing efficiency at a rate that, if it continued unaddressed, would eventually pass a threshold beyond which the processor could fail entirely, and quickly, rather than gradually. "How long," I asked, already dreading the answer, "before that threshold is reached?" She ran the numbers herself, cross-referencing the decay rate against the processor's known specifications, which the Coalition database provided in full technical detail. It took her less than 2 minutes to produce an estimate, though she checked it 3 separate times before speaking it aloud, as if hoping the third calculation might somehow produce a gentler answer than the first 2. "6 days," she said, "maybe 7 if we're generous. After that, based on the failure profile in the specifications, the processor doesn't degrade further, it stops, completely and quickly." I asked what would happen to the colony if the processor stopped completely. She did not answer that question directly. She did not need to. I had read enough files by then to understand exactly what happened to a population of 200,000 people when their primary source of breathable air simply ceased to function, especially if that population had not yet begun any meaningful evacuation. I asked Fenlo whether the Thren Ministry of Continuance, the governing body responsible for exactly this kind of colony risk, had been notified of the readings. He checked and confirmed that they had, in fact, already convened a formal review committee that very morning, following standard coalition protocol for any anomalous infrastructure report affecting colony safety. Grace asked him what the estimated timeline was for that committee to reach a decision. Fenlo checked again and read the answer directly from the official notice. 6 days, standard procedure, allowing time for full technical review, stakeholder consultation, and formal ratification of whatever response the committee ultimately decided to authorize. I watched Grace's face as she absorbed that number, and I saw, more clearly than I had seen at any point since her arrival, the exact moment her calm composure cracked slightly under the weight of what the number meant. 6 days for the committee. 6 days, perhaps 7, before the processor failed entirely. The numbers were not simply close. They were, by her own estimate, running almost exactly parallel, with no meaningful buffer between the moment the committee reached its decision and the moment the danger it was meant to address became irreversible. "This is it," she said quietly, more to herself than to either Fenlo or me. "This is the gap, happening right now, while we're standing here watching it happen." I asked her, carefully, what she intended to do with this information, given that the Assembly had already refused her request for any active intervention authority only days earlier. She did not answer me immediately. She turned back to the terminal instead, pulling up everything she could find about Thren Vahal itself, not just the processor readings but the colony's population records, its evacuation infrastructure, its communication systems, anything that might tell her not just what was wrong, but what could still be done about it. I watched her work for nearly an hour without interruption, occasionally answering questions I could help with, more often simply standing beside her as she absorbed an entire colony's worth of technical documentation with the same terrifying speed she had shown on her very first day in our reading hall. Eventually she sat back, and I saw that same tightening of her jaw I had come to recognize as the sign of a decision already made, whether or not she had spoken it aloud yet. "Their own atmospheric models," she said, "the ones built into their own emergency planning documents, show that full evacuation of a colony this size, done properly, with adequate notice, takes about 5 days from the moment people are told to begin." I did the arithmetic myself, slowly, the way I did most arithmetic, and I felt something cold settle into my chest as the numbers aligned themselves in my mind. If the committee took its full 6 days to decide, and evacuation then required 5 more days to complete, the total time needed would exceed, by a full working day, the maximum time the processor itself was expected to survive before catastrophic failure. "They're already too late," I said quietly, "even if the committee makes the right decision, on time, by their own standards." Grace nodded, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something in her expression that looked less like calm professional interest and more like genuine fear, quickly suppressed but unmistakably present. "Not too late yet," she said, "but close, closer than anyone on that committee probably realizes, because they're still treating this like a standard review instead of an emergency, because nobody's told them yet that the timeline doesn't work." I asked her whether we could simply tell them ourselves, through proper channels, alerting the Thren Ministry directly to the danger of their own timeline before the 6 days had fully elapsed. She considered this, and for a moment I believed she might agree, that this reasonable, measured approach might satisfy her, without requiring anything more drastic. Fenlo suggested drafting an official archive advisory, flagging the timeline discrepancy for the ministry's urgent attention, a document that could be prepared and transmitted within a matter of hours. Grace agreed to let him try it. I want to be honest, that she did not dismiss the proper channel outright. She gave it a real chance, watching closely as Fenlo drafted the advisory with careful, formal language, exactly the kind of document our archive was authorized to send. The advisory went out that same afternoon, addressed directly to the ministry's review committee, flagging the mismatch between their decision timeline and the processor's failure window in the clearest terms our formal language allowed. The reply came back 6 hours later, polite, measured, and utterly unhurried. The committee thanked the archive for its input, noted that the concern would be added to the agenda for consideration during the scheduled review process, and confirmed that the standard 6-day timeline would remain in effect pending further technical assessment. I watched Grace read that reply twice, her expression unreadable, and then a third time, slower, as if searching for some hidden urgency buried beneath the polite formal language that simply was not there. Added to the agenda, she repeated softly, for consideration, during the scheduled review. She set the reply down, and I understood, watching her, that we had just witnessed, in real time, on a living world, the exact same flat, doomed line she had shown me 100 times across 100 old files. Knowledge delivered, urgency ignored. The gap, quietly, patiently, continuing to widen while everyone involved followed procedure exactly as they were supposed to. "They're not being foolish," she said, almost as if reassuring herself. "They're being careful, exactly as careful as every committee in every file we've read. And it's going to cost them almost the same amount of time it cost everyone else." I asked her, my voice quieter than I intended, what she planned to do now that the proper channel had failed to produce the urgency the situation actually required. She looked at me for a long moment, and then at Fenlo, and then back at the timeline glowing on her terminal, the 6 days of committee deliberation running almost exactly parallel to the 6 or 7 days before total processor failure, with barely any room between them for 200,000 people to reach safety. "I'm going to close the gap myself," she said, "since nobody else seems willing to move fast enough to do it for them." I told her, honestly, that such an action would almost certainly violate at least a dozen separate coalition regulations regarding both archive conduct and interference in another civilization's internal affairs, and that the consequences for her personally could be severe. She nodded, acknowledging the warning without letting it change the determination already settled behind her eyes. 200,000 people, she said quietly, against a dozen regulations. I know which side of that I'm choosing. I did not stop her. I want to be honest about that, in this account, exactly as I would want it recorded in any file our archive ever preserves. I stood beside her instead, and I asked her what she needed from me in order to move as quickly as the danger required. She looked at me with something that, for the briefest moment, resembled gratitude, before her focus snapped back entirely to the work in front of her, the work of turning 100 old warnings into one that might, for the first time in the history of our entire collection, arrive in time to actually matter. Fenlo asked her, nervously, what exactly she meant by closing the gap herself. He reminded her, gently, that archive scholars were bound by strict rules regarding contact with active colony populations, rules meant to prevent exactly the kind of unauthorized interference she now seemed to be considering. Grace did not answer him immediately. Instead, she began pulling up the Thren Vahal communication infrastructure, studying how information moved through the colony, from official channels down to individual households, mapping the entire system with the same speed and focus she had shown toward every file in our collection. I asked her what she was looking for. She explained that most colony worlds, regardless of species, maintained a public information feed, a channel meant for weather updates, transport schedules, and other everyday civic matters, one that ordinary citizens checked constantly without needing any special permission or clearance. "If I can reach that feed," she said, "I don't need the ministry's permission, I just need the truth, and enough time for people to act on it." Fenlo looked genuinely frightened by this idea, and I understood his fear completely, because I shared it. Publishing directly to a colony's public feed, bypassing the ministry entirely, was not a minor procedural violation. It was the kind of act that could end her standing with the coalition permanently, and quite possibly end mine as well, given how deeply I had already involved myself in supporting her. I asked her whether there was any other path, any final proper channel we had not yet exhausted, before resorting to something so drastic. She considered the question seriously. I want to note that clearly, because I do not wish this account to suggest she acted recklessly or without proper deliberation. She spent nearly 20 minutes exploring alternatives with Fenlo, contacting a secondary coalition oversight office, attempting to reach an emergency response coordinator whose title suggested exactly the kind of authority we needed, only to learn that the coordinator's office required the same formal review process as the ministry itself, with no meaningful exception for urgency. "Every door leads back to the same committee," she said finally, quiet frustration entering her voice for the first time since I had known her. "Every single one. They built an entire system designed to prevent exactly the kind of fast decision this situation needs." I asked her whether she believed the system had been built poorly, or whether it had simply never anticipated a danger arriving quite this quickly, quite this precisely aligned against its own procedural timeline. "Both," she said. "I don't think anyone built this system to fail. I think they built it assuming disasters would always leave enough room for careful process. Sometimes they don't, and nobody built anything to catch the moment when they don't." She turned back to the terminal, and I watched her begin drafting something directly, a short message, plain and unadorned, meant not for officials or committees, but for ordinary people who would wake up the next morning still trusting that their heir would simply continue working, exactly as it always had. I read the draft over her shoulder as she wrote it. It contained no accusations against the ministry, no criticism of the committee's process, nothing that could be construed as inflammatory or designed to provoke panic. It simply stated the facts as clearly as our archive's own analysis had established them. The processor showed a decay pattern consistent with failure within 6 to 7 days. Evacuation, if begun immediately, would take approximately 5 days to complete safely. The message ended with a single, simple recommendation that citizens not wait for official confirmation before beginning to make their own preparations to leave. Fenlo read it as well, and I watched the color drain slightly from his face as he absorbed exactly what she intended to send, and to whom, and how completely it would bypass every layer of authority that existed specifically to prevent this kind of direct action. "If you send this," he said quietly, "and you're wrong, even slightly wrong, you will have caused a panic on an entire colony world for nothing. And if you're right, you will still be blamed because you took a decision that wasn't yours to take." Grace looked at him steadily, and her answer, when it came, was calmer than I expected, though no less resolute for its calm. "If I'm wrong," she said, "I will apologize to every single person I frightened, publicly, completely, and I will accept whatever consequences the coalition decides are appropriate. But I have checked these numbers 4 times now, against their own specifications, using their own models. I am not wrong, and if I do nothing while I know that, then I am choosing the same flat line as everyone in every file we have already read together." I found, in that moment, that I had nothing left to offer in argument against her. I had spent 11,000 cycles of my order's history preserving the consequences of exactly this kind of hesitation, carefully annotated, perfectly documented, utterly unable to change anything for the people already lost inside those files. I was not willing to add one more file to that collection, while still possessing the power to prevent it. "Send it," I told her, "and I want this recorded honestly, in my own words, exactly as I spoke them that day. Send it, and I will stand beside whatever comes after." The message went out at the end of that day, time-stamped and unmistakably attributed to Grace herself rather than hidden behind any official archive authority, because she insisted, over both my objection and Fenlo's, that whoever read it deserved to know exactly who was speaking to them and why. I did not sleep again that night. I do not believe Fenlo did either. We sat together in the reading hall, watching whatever reports trickled back through the coalition relay, waiting to learn whether 200,000 strangers, on a world none of us had ever visited, would choose to believe a single human they had never met, over the careful, familiar silence of their own government's ongoing review. The first reports arrived within hours, and they were not encouraging. Several prominent voices within the Thren colony itself denounced the message immediately, calling it irresponsible, unauthorized, and dangerously premature. A statement from the Ministry of Continuance, released not long after, confirmed that the committee's review remained on schedule, and gently but firmly reminded citizens that official guidance should always take precedence over unverified claims from outside sources, regardless of their origin. I watched Grace read that statement without any visible reaction at all, though I had come to recognize by then that her stillness in moments like this concealed far more than it revealed. "They're not wrong to say that," she said quietly. "Under normal circumstances, official guidance should take precedence. I understand exactly why they're saying it. I just don't think these are normal circumstances." The numbers that mattered, though, did not come from statements or denouncements. They came from the transport logs, which Fenlo monitored continuously through the Coalition relay, tracking departures from the colony's evacuation ports in real time. By the end of the first night, transport logs showed that a small but meaningful fraction of the population, perhaps 3%, had already begun making arrangements to leave, entirely on their own initiative, without waiting for any official evacuation order. It was not much, but it was, Grace pointed out, already more than the official evacuation plan would have produced in the same time frame, since the plan itself had not even been formally approved yet, still awaiting the committee's full 6-day review. The second day brought more movement. Word had apparently spread through the colony's own informal networks, families warning other families, neighbors comparing notes, ordinary people doing what Grace had done herself only days earlier, checking the numbers against publicly available specifications and reaching the same uncomfortable conclusion she had reached. By the third day, the percentage of citizens actively preparing to leave had climbed past 20%, and the ministry, apparently unable to ignore the growing movement any longer, issued a second statement, this one notably less dismissive than the first, acknowledging that the technical concerns raised were being given expedited priority within the ongoing review. Grace read that second statement carefully, several times, searching for any concrete change in the actual timeline rather than simply the tone of the language. "Expedited priority," she said finally. "That's not a new deadline. That's just a nicer way of saying we're still on schedule, but we feel bad about it now." I asked her whether the growing citizen movement changed her assessment of the situation at all, whether the independent action of the population itself might be sufficient without any further intervention from her. She considered this seriously, running updated calculations against the actual departure rate, cross-referencing it against the total population and the processor's failure window, which by her most recent estimate had narrowed slightly, now suggesting failure within 5 to 6 days rather than the original 6 to 7. 20% isn't enough, she said. Not yet. At this rate, we'll reach maybe 50% evacuated by the time the processor actually fails, if it fails exactly when the models predict. That leaves 100,000 people still on the surface when the air stops working. I asked her what more she believed could be done, given that her original message had already produced more movement than the official process alone would have managed. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she pulled up the ministry's official evacuation infrastructure records again, studying transport capacity, departure schedules, anything that might reveal some additional lever still unused. She found it in the colony's emergency broadcast system, a network of alert channels reserved specifically for confirmed, official emergencies, distinct from the general public feed she had used for her first message. Access to that system required ministry authorization, which neither of us possessed and had no realistic way of obtaining within the remaining time frame. "I can't use their emergency system," she said, "but I can make it impossible for them to justify not using it themselves." She spent the following hours compiling every piece of data we had gathered into a single, undeniable technical brief, formatted precisely according to Coalition emergency reporting standards, and transmitted it not just to the Thren Ministry, but simultaneously to 3 separate Coalition oversight bodies, along with a public timestamp confirming exactly when each recipient had received it. It was, she explained to me afterward, a calculated pressure. Any oversight body that received clear, well-documented evidence of an imminent catastrophic risk and failed to act on it would bear direct and undeniable responsibility for that failure, a responsibility no committee could easily hide behind procedural language after the fact. The pressure worked, though not quickly and not without cost. On the fourth day, under mounting scrutiny from multiple directions at once, the Thren Ministry finally activated its emergency broadcast system, issuing a formal evacuation order nearly 2 full days ahead of its original scheduled decision. Grace did not celebrate when the order came through. She simply nodded once, checked the updated transport logs, and returned immediately to monitoring the departure rate, still calculating, still refining her estimate of how many people would actually reach safety before the processor's failure window closed entirely. The final days passed in a blur of numbers, departures, and long silent hours spent watching transport logs climb steadily upward. By the 5th day, evacuation had reached 60%. By the start of the 6th day, it had climbed past 70%, driven now by the full weight of official emergency broadcasts working in concert with the citizen movement Grace's original message had first sparked days earlier. The processor failed on the 5th day of the 6th cycle since her first message, precisely within the window she had calculated from the very beginning, though slightly earlier than the most cautious estimate had suggested. By the time it stopped functioning entirely, evacuation records confirmed that 71% of the colony's population had already reached safety, either through official transport or independent arrangements made in the days following Grace's initial warning. I do not know, and I do not believe anyone will ever know with certainty, how many additional lives were lost, specifically because those final days of official process consumed time that could have gone toward evacuation instead. But I know, because Grace showed me the calculation herself, working through it slowly and carefully in the quiet hours after the processor finally failed, that under the original 6-day committee timeline, without her intervention, evacuation would have reached only 12% by the same point, based on the standard rate of official evacuation orders across similar coalition incidents in our own archive. 71% against a projected 12%. The difference between those two numbers was not an abstraction. It was measured, unmistakably, in lives. The consequences for Grace arrived almost as quickly as the gratitude did, and for several days the two seemed to move through the coalition network in strange, uncomfortable parallel with one another. A formal complaint was filed against her within a day of the processor's failure, submitted jointly by several delegate species who argued, with genuine conviction rather than simple bureaucratic reflex, that her actions represented a dangerous and unacceptable precedent. If a single visiting scholar could bypass an entire civilization's internal decision process whenever she personally judged the timeline too slow, they argued, then no government's authority over its own emergency response could ever again be considered secure from outside interference. I understood their argument, and I want to be honest in this account that I did not dismiss it as easily as Grace seemed to. Every civilization represented within our collection guarded its own sovereignty carefully, often for reasons rooted in painful history, histories of outside powers who had once claimed the right to act on their behalf without consent, usually to disastrous and exploitative ends. Grace's intervention, however well-intentioned, however mathematically justified, still represented exactly the kind of unilateral outside action that centuries of careful coalition law had been built specifically to prevent. She was summoned before a special session of the Assembly, larger and more formal than the small liaison meeting she had faced only weeks earlier. I attended alongside her, having requested and been granted permission to testify on her behalf, given my own direct involvement in supporting her throughout the entire sequence of events. The delegate who spoke first against her was a tall, severe figure named Consul Varnhead, representing one of the oldest member species within the coalition, a civilization whose own catastrophe files included several painful instances of outside interference that had ended in tragedy rather than salvation. Consul Varnhead did not raise his voice, and somehow that made his argument more unsettling rather than less. He described, methodically, a hypothetical scenario in which a well-meaning outsider, convinced of their own correct judgment, intervened in a crisis based on incomplete information, causing a panic that killed more people than the original danger ever would have, all under the same justification Grace herself had used, that waiting was simply too slow. The defendant was right this time, he said, his gaze moving deliberately toward Grace as he spoke. But rightness after the fact does not establish the safety of the method used to arrive at it. We are not here merely to judge one outcome. We are here to judge whether the method that produced it should ever be permitted to exist within coalition space again. Grace was given the opportunity to respond, and I watched her stand, calm as she had been from the very first day I met her, though I could see now, having spent weeks in her company, the careful control it took to maintain that calm under the weight of the consul's argument. She did not deny the danger in her own method. This surprised several delegates. I could see it in their expressions, the way they had clearly prepared themselves for a defense built on justification rather than honest acknowledgement of risk. Consul Varnhead is right, she said. My method is dangerous. Acting on incomplete information, especially outside the sovereignty of the people affected, is exactly the kind of danger every rule in this assembly was built to prevent. For good reason, built on real histories of real harm. She paused, letting that acknowledgement settle fully before continuing. But committees waiting past the point their own evidence tells them to act is also dangerous. I have read 100 files from this archive proving it, in detail, across 100 different worlds. The Assembly has spent 11,000 cycles building careful rules against one danger, the danger of acting too fast on bad information. I am asking you to now spend some real effort building careful rules against the other danger, the one sitting quietly in almost every file this archive has ever preserved, the danger of waiting too long on good information. The chamber was silent after she finished speaking, and I watched several delegates exchange glances I could not fully interpret, caught somewhere between the discomfort of an argument they had not expected and the reluctant respect that comes from recognizing an uncomfortable truth clearly spoken. The Assembly did not resolve the matter that day. Formal condemnation proceedings against Grace continued for the following week, running in parallel, almost surreally, alongside an entirely separate stream of messages arriving from the surviving population of Threnn Vahal itself. Those messages, unlike the formal proceedings, contained no careful legal argument, no measured concern about precedent or sovereignty. They were simple, direct, and overwhelming in their gratitude. Families thanking her by name for the days of extra warning that had let them gather their children and leave before the official order ever came. A father, thanking her for the specific window of time that had let him reach his elderly parents in a distant district and bring them to safety before transport capacity ran out entirely. A young engineer, one of the very scientists who had originally flagged the processor's anomaly, writing simply to say that he had read her published analysis and recognized, immediately, that she had understood his own data faster and more completely than his own superiors had been willing to. I sat with Grace one evening during that strange week, both streams of communication open on the terminal before us, condemnation on one side and gratitude on the other, and I asked her how she reconciled the two. She was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried none of the calm certainty I had grown used to, only something more honest and more tired. "I don't think they're actually in conflict," she said. "The consul is worried about the next time someone does this and gets it wrong. He should be worried about that. I'm worried about the next time someone doesn't do this, and 200,000 people become a file instead of a warning. Both things are true at the same time. That's the whole problem. That's why nobody's solved it in 11,000 cycles." I did not have an answer for her, not that evening, but I found myself for the first time in my long service to the archive, hoping desperately that the Assembly's eventual decision would find some way to hold both truths at once, rather than simply choosing the easier, more familiar path of condemning the method entirely and returning, quietly, gratefully, to the comfortable slowness that had governed our collection for 11,000 cycles before Grace ever walked through our doors. The assembly's final decision came 11 days later, far faster than the standard 180-day review cycle I had once quoted to Grace, a fact that did not escape her notice when the announcement finally arrived. I stood beside her in the same chamber where Consul Varnhead had first laid out his careful warning, watching as the presiding delegate, a measured official named Idris Halloway, read the assembly's ruling aloud to a chamber that had grown considerably fuller than it had been during the earlier proceedings. Word of the Thren Vahal outcome having spread widely enough that several additional delegations had requested attendance simply to witness the decision firsthand. The ruling, when it came, satisfied almost no one entirely, which Grace later told me was usually a sign that a decision had been reasoned honestly rather than politically. Grace was formally reprimanded for bypassing established protocol, a reprimand that would remain permanently on her record within coalition systems, acknowledging clearly that her method, however successful in this instance, could not be sanctioned as a general practice without risking exactly the kind of unaccountable outside interference Consul Varnhead had warned against. But the assembly did not stop there. In the same ruling, they acknowledged, in language more direct than I had ever heard an assembly document use, that the pattern Grace had identified across the archive's collection represented a genuine and previously unaddressed failure within coalition emergency governance, one that had likely contributed to preventable loss of life across numerous member worlds throughout coalition history. The assembly authorized, on a trial basis, the creation of an entirely new position, one that had never before existed within our order or within coalition governance more broadly. Archive Liaison for Predictive Continuance, a role explicitly designed to identify patterns of dangerous delay within active, ongoing situations, and to escalate them directly to independent emergency oversight, bypassing the standard committee review process specifically in cases where mathematical evidence indicated the review process itself would consume more time than the danger allowed. Grace was offered the position, the first of its kind, with the explicit understanding that her authority would remain limited, subject to independent verification, and permanently open to review should the position ever be misused or produce a serious error in judgment. I watched her consider the offer for a long moment before answering, and I understood, watching her, that she was weighing not just the responsibility itself, but the reprimand that would follow her regardless of how carefully she performed the role from this point forward, a permanent mark suggesting she had once broken the very rules she would now be trusted to help enforce with greater speed. She accepted, but not without a condition of her own, one she stated clearly and without hesitation, exactly as she had stated every important thing since the day I first met her reading that plague file in 40 minutes. "I'll take the position," she said, "on one condition. Every file in this archive, going forward, gets a new field added to its record. Not just what happened, not just how it happened, how long they knew before they acted. I want that number attached to every single file we hold, old and new, so that anyone who ever reads this collection again sees the gap immediately, without having to build the chart themselves the way I had to." The assembly granted the condition without significant debate, perhaps recognizing, as I had come to recognize myself over the preceding weeks, that the addition cost them nothing and offered a genuine chance at preventing exactly the kind of tragedy our archive existed to memorialize. The work of adding that field to 10 million existing files began the following week, a task so large that our entire order, every curator across every reading hall in the archive, was assigned some portion of the effort. I took charge of the earliest files myself, the oldest catastrophes in our collection, dating back further than even my own long service could fully comprehend, and I found, working through them one by one, that Grace's pattern held true with a consistency that unsettled me more each time I confirmed it again. Warning, delay, consequence. The same shape, file after file, species after species, century after century, varying only in the length of the gap and the scale of what was lost within it. Grace herself moved into a small office near the reading hall, converted specifically for her new role, equipped with direct access to Coalition sensor feeds from every member world, monitored continuously for exactly the kind of anomalous pattern that had first appeared in the Threnvahal processor readings weeks earlier. I visited her there often in the following months, partly out of genuine friendship, which had grown steadily between us since that first strange day, and partly because I found myself drawn to watching her work, still fascinated by the speed and clarity with which she moved through problems that would have taken my own order months or years to properly assess. She caught 3 more emerging situations in her first season alone, none as severe as Threnvahal, though she told me plainly that severity was not really the measure that mattered. What mattered, she said, was the gap itself, catching it early enough that the response, whatever form it took, never needed to become the kind of drastic, headline-worthy intervention that had defined her first case. The best version of this job, she told me one evening, reviewing a minor infrastructure concern on a distant mining colony that her system had flagged 3 full weeks before any human, or any member of any other species, would likely have noticed it themselves, is the version where nobody ever hears about it, because it never became a crisis at all. Quiet prevention doesn't make headlines. It just means fewer new files for you to catalog. I asked her, one final evening, months after the position had settled into something resembling routine, whether she ever regretted the reprimand still attached permanently to her record, the one blemish on an otherwise remarkable achievement. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything, and then shook her head slowly. No, she said, the reprimand means the rule still exists. It means the next person who wants to bypass the committee for a good reason has to actually prove it's a good reason, the way I had to prove it, instead of just doing whatever they feel like whenever they feel like it. I don't want a world where anyone can override anyone else's decisions just by claiming urgency. I want a world where the override only works when the math actually backs it up, every single time, checked and rechecked, exactly the way I checked mine 4 times before I ever sent that message. It was on a quiet evening not long after that conversation that she called me into her office, her expression carrying a familiar tightness around the jaw that I had learned, by then, to recognize immediately. She showed me a new entry in the system, flagged only hours earlier by the very monitoring network she had built. Catastrophe file number 10,000,001, though it did not yet carry that designation officially, since the situation it described was still actively unfolding, somewhere within Coalition space, on a world I had never heard the name of before that exact moment. A ministry, on a colony experiencing an early-stage agricultural failure that threatened food security for its population within the coming growing season, had already convened a review committee. The committee's own preliminary estimate, already logged within the system, suggested a decision timeline of 11 days before any formal response would be authorized. Grace was already cross-referencing the failure's rate of progression against the committee's timeline before I had even finished reading the initial summary myself, her fingers moving across the display with the same speed and certainty I had watched on her very first day in our reading hall, though now that speed carried the full weight of an authorized position behind it, rather than simply the audacity of an unauthorized visitor. She found what she was looking for within minutes, the same shape she had shown me 100 times before, warning already delivered, response still pending, the gap already beginning to widen exactly as it always had, on every world, in every file, across every corner of the stars our collection had ever reached. She read the committee's own preliminary estimate one final time, checking it against her own calculations exactly as thoroughly as she had checked the Threnvahal numbers all those months earlier, and then she looked up at me, and I saw, in her expression, not frustration, not fear, but something closer to familiar, weary determination, the look of someone beginning a task she now understood she would likely spend the rest of her working life repeating, again and again, one gap at a time, for as long as committees anywhere continued moving at the speed of their meetings, rather than the speed of their disasters. 11 days, she said quietly, already drafting the emergency escalation notice that her new authority now permitted her to send directly, without waiting for anyone's permission, to exactly the people who needed to see it fastest. She did not look up again until the notice was already sent, time-stamped, verified, and moving through the coalition network at a speed no committee anywhere could match. I remained in her office a while longer that evening, watching her work, and I found myself thinking back over the entire strange sequence of events that had brought us to this quiet, ordinary moment. An alien curator and a human scholar sitting together in a small converted office, calmly saving lives that would never know how close they had come to becoming another entry in our collection. I thought of Consul Varnhead and the argument he had made so carefully before the assembly, an argument I still believed held real weight, even now, even after everything Grace had accomplished. I thought about how the two of them, in a strange way, had each been building toward the same eventual answer from opposite directions. Varnhead insisting that method mattered as much as outcome, Grace insisting that outcome could not be ignored simply because the method felt uncomfortable to those in power. The position the assembly had created, flawed and limited as it remained, existed only because both of those pressures had been allowed to meet honestly in the same chamber, rather than one simply overwhelming the other. Fenlo joined us partway through that evening, carrying with him an update on the ongoing project to annotate our full 10 million files with Grace's new field, the length of the gap between knowledge and action. He reported that the work, though still far from finished, had already produced something none of us had fully anticipated when the assembly first authorized it. Scholars across the archive, curators like myself who had spent entire careers studying these files without ever quite naming the pattern Grace had identified within her first hour among us, had begun independently requesting access to her latency data, not merely to complete the annotation project, but because they found themselves, as I had, unable to look at any file the same way again once the gap had been made visible and measurable rather than simply implied within the sorrowful pacing of careful historical prose. Several of the older curators, including Orrin Vask, who had once questioned whether Grace's very first reading session should even be permitted to continue, had begun proposing their own modest refinements to standard archive practice. Small changes meant to shorten review timelines for genuinely urgent material without abandoning the careful deliberation that remained appropriate for matters where speed offered no real advantage. I found this development quietly remarkable, watching an institution 11,000 cycles old begin adjusting its own settled habits, not through any grand decree, but through the accumulated weight of a pattern finally named clearly enough that it could no longer be politely ignored. Grace listened to Fenlo's report without pausing her work on the agricultural failure notice, though I could see she was absorbing every word of it carefully, filing it away alongside everything else she tracked with that same quiet, relentless attention. "It's not really about me," she said eventually, once Fenlo had finished. "I just happened to read the files fast enough to see the shape all at once, instead of one small piece at a time across an entire career. Anyone could have seen it, if they'd had the same view I had." I told her, honestly, that I did not believe this was entirely true. Many curators before her, myself included, had read individual files carrying exactly the same pattern she identified, and none of us had ever thought to compile them into a single chart, to ask why the shape repeated, to wonder whether the warning contained within each file might someday be made to arrive before the tragedy it described rather than only after. Speed alone had not produced her insight. Speed combined with a particular refusal to accept that slowness was simply the natural order of careful, respectful memory that had produced it. She did not argue the point further, though I suspected she still did not fully agree with me, and in a strange way I found that quiet disagreement between us comforting, a small, ordinary friction between two people who had built, through very different instincts and very different histories, something neither of our civilizations could have built entirely alone. The agricultural failure notice on her display finished transmitting a few minutes later, and almost immediately a response began scrolling across a secondary channel, the ministry in question acknowledging receipt of the escalation and confirming, remarkably, that an emergency subcommittee would convene within the day to review the matter, rather than waiting for the full 11-day process originally scheduled. Grace watched the confirmation appear with the same careful attention she gave everything, checking the response time against her own internal sense of what constituted genuine urgency versus polite but empty reassurance. "A day," she said quietly. "That's still not fast enough for some situations, but it's better than 11. It's a smaller gap than the one before it, and a smaller gap than the one before that." She looked up at me, and something in her expression softened slightly, the tired satisfaction of someone who understood that her work would never produce a single triumphant ending, only a long, ongoing series of smaller gaps, each one a little narrower than the last, each narrowing bought through patient, repeated effort rather than any single decisive victory. I asked her, as I often did during our quiet evenings together, whether she believed the gap could ever be closed entirely, whether some future version of our combined efforts might one day produce a galaxy where no committee anywhere moved slower than the danger it was meant to address. She considered the question the way she considered everything, seriously, without offering false comfort simply because comfort might have been easier to hear. "No," she said, "I don't think it closes completely. Not ever. New dangers keep showing up faster than institutions can learn to trust the people who see them coming first. That's not a flaw we're going to fix once and be done with. It's just the actual shape of trying to protect large groups of people who can't all see the same danger at the same moment, with the same clarity." She paused, glancing back at her display, at the small green confirmation still glowing quietly in the corner of the screen. "But I think we can keep making it smaller, file by file, gap by gap. That's really the only version of winning this particular problem actually offers." I did not have a response prepared for that either, though I found, sitting with her in that small converted office as the evening deepened around us, that I no longer felt the need to have one. Some truths I had learned across these strange, transformative months did not require a curator's careful annotation to be understood. They simply required someone patient enough and quick enough and stubborn enough to notice them clearly and brave enough to act while noticing was still enough to make a difference. Grace turned back to her queue, already scanning the next flagged anomaly waiting silently within the system, some small warning light blinking on a world whose name neither of us yet knew, whose danger had not yet fully revealed itself, whose committee had not yet begun its careful, well-meaning, dangerously familiar deliberation. "Too slow," she muttered, exactly as she had on the very first day I ever met her, and then, without another word, she turned fully to the next flagged anomaly, already waiting in her queue, and got to work.